One of the things I like to say is that your finance team shouldn't find out that you switched to a new payment service provider after you've gone live. One of the things we've done with success is pre-mortem. Everybody in tech is familiar with a post-mortem. You have some sort of problem that was avoidable in some capacity, right? Or maybe not avoidable. You just want to understand what went wrong. You take a look at everything through a fine-tooth comb. You come up with a suggestion on how you can prevent it moving forward. A pre-mortem takes that same idea, but puts it before you actually do the thing that caused the issue. Sitting down and really trying to map out all of the ways things could potentially go wrong before you actually launch gives you a solid strategy for understanding who needs to be involved, making sure that you plan for redundancy, you plan for the worst case scenario, and you hope for the best. The best way to improve your payments performance is to partner with a PSP who is willing to spend the time to understand exactly what's going on beneath the hood.
Integration with payment provider can go wrong for so many reasons. This is why I really enjoyed this conversation with Michael Taylor, the Director of Solution Engineering at Checkout.com. We discussed multiple topics in this conversation, including aligning with internal and external stakeholders on the expectations, building the proper communication channels, and all other processes that you want to implement after going live. I really enjoyed this conversation with Michael, and Michael have so many tactical advices that can be implemented. Please welcome Michael Taylor.
Hi, Michael, and thank you so much for joining Payments FM.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
Let's think about the situation where business already choose their payment provider. They want to enable payments and they want to go forward with processing payments, or maybe like their switching provider, doesn't matter. But what are the most important next steps after they chose the provider, they sign the contract, and what's left there?
I think this is one of the areas where there tends to be some avoidable friction whenever you're looking at either adding a PSP to your existing stack or switching PSPs entirely. One of the things that I think our team does pretty well is utilizes support channels that are maybe less common. We set up a shared Slack channel for all of our customers that use Slack. That works really well because you get a quick real-time feedback when questions pop up and don't get lost in the inbox. I think that's one of the areas where we tend to see a lot of focus is on establishing those communication habits and paradigms upfront so that there's no questions that get left in the ether and, usually end up boiling up later on and cause problems. I think the second next step would be really making sure expectations are set properly. One of the things we do is utilize a document we create. It's called a solutions overview document. It's nothing too crazy or complicated. It's just a living document that basically outlines the expectations of each party as well as any key milestones. So want to make sure that you have a firm go live date in mind, and usually we'll work backwards depending on how many resources you have as a merchant, what sort of resources your PSP offers, as well as the scope of the integration. Moving backwards from there allows you to write in some pretty clear milestones, and that's usually a good way to get things started in what I would consider to be the next steps. Following that, you want to make sure that you have regular communication based on whatever your preference might be. We generally start twice a week, and then you can always slim down those meetings as necessary if you want to switch to once a week stand-ups or something like that. But early days, I would say that's a pretty standard way of looking at what are the next steps, tactically speaking, after the decision has been made to engage with the new PSP.
So let me summarize a little bit. The first thing, you have a document that outlines the scope of integration. Then you have weekly meetings where businesses can discuss all the questions, right? And basically to discuss how the process going. But for more urgent and day-to-day conversation, you have a channel, something similar to like shared Slack group, right?
Mm-hmm.
And where you can discuss.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
The purpose of the document is to capture things that live in people's heads, but aren't necessarily considered important in the moment. Maybe you have somebody who is only involved in a couple of meetings up front, and they ask a question about reporting time zones. That's something super important to that particular business unit. If you don't write that down, chances are that kind of information gets lost in the shuffle. So being able to just document that sort of thing right when you hear about it and utilize that real-time communication channel for things that pop up so that you're not bottlenecking any of the integration work, we found to be pretty successful.
I think you raised a pretty interesting question, right? Like reporting time zones. I think it's not obvious at the beginning for a project manager or product manager owning the integration to find and understand all these details from different teams or the total scope of requirements. What would you recommend for situations like this, for basically like for the integrational team, understand these questions sooner rather than kind of like after the launch when it's already too late?
It's a great question. And I think that's an area where there is some friction that can usually be avoided. The types of stakeholders that need to be brought into these conversations should have ideally been identified before the contract is signed. You need to understand what functional groups need to be represented and have buy-in or training on these things. One of the things I like to say is that your finance team shouldn't find out that you switched to a new payment service provider after you've gone live, right? They need to be, even if they're not the ones responsible for actually doing the development work, involved in the conversations pretty early on in the design phase, just so that those sorts of things don't get left behind. So I think it really comes back to just working with somebody who has a good understanding of what sort of cross-functional groups tend to be required for this sort of initiative.
When I'm thinking about it, like you mentioned, the finance team or reporting and who needs to be trained, we definitely have great technical integration with API. It also includes user experience and design. Because it includes user experience, you probably need to engage like compliance and legal teams, right, to verify like UI and basically the flow. Definitely finance team involved, and a support team and all the teams who are touching the customer needs to be involved. And when I'm saying this, it sounds like the whole company needs to be represented when switching payment providers. Is this how you see it about it?
Yeah, I mean, payments is a really important component to online businesses. It's the lifeblood of any online business. It doesn't matter what you're selling, B2B or B2C. If you can't make payments, then you have a pretty big problem. That shows the level of engagement you need to have with different cross-functional groups. It comes down to more of an art than a science, just because these different groups aren't necessarily cleanly aligned across different companies. You might have a whole payments function at a company that's got a really sophisticated payment stack, and they're just looking to do the same thing they've done maybe 5 times, 6 times in the past, add a new PSP for whatever reason it might be, redundancy, local expansion, cost savings, or the opposite end of the spectrum, a super high growth scale up who maybe has 10 people at the entire company. They've only used one PSP because they didn't know that payments had a strategic impact. So I think the level of engagement there is just going to be, it's always going to be cross-functional, but exactly how cross-functional it is going to be pretty different from company to company.
Some payment providers require certification before going live. And I think there is like different opinions about that in the industry. Some see this as a friction to go live and delaying the go live date. But some may see it as being confident in the solution, right? And just to be sure that all the refunds and chargebacks work properly and managed as expected. What is your opinion about that? Do you think some sort of certification before go live is a good idea?
It's an interesting question. I think at the beginning of e-commerce's heyday, there was a much bigger focus on the certification process and having a formal sign-off. And most of the time, what that resulted in was some person physically sitting down, combing through logs, combing through a whole bunch of different things that was incredibly time consuming and generally speaking was not a good experience for anyone. The merchants would most of the time be held up, because maybe somebody was on vacation and the queue got really deep, or there was some miscommunication and the certification was done improperly for a specific scenario. So the way I look at it is that a certification process is only as good as its design. I don't know that a strict certification process is really necessary in 2025 with the sort of tooling that we have available to us. This is an area where I think AI, if you're not using AI to do this sort of thing already as a PSP or as a merchant, you're already behind the rest of your cohort. This is something that we, just as a specific example, have done to quite good effect, utilize an AI-based solution that can automatically comb through different incoming requests in our sandbox and make recommendations based on payload changes that need to occur, customer data integrity problems. It's really easy for AI to identify a mistagged merchant-initiated transaction, which we know has a negative impact to approval rates once you go into production. But if you're relying on a human to look through 1,000 transactions to catch 1 out of 1,000 occurrence, it's pretty time-consuming. I do think there's still an important place for certification in the card present space because there are so many different providers involved right now. You're dealing with key exchanges, key injection facilities, you're dealing with terminal vendors, you're dealing with estate management, before the payment actually makes it into the PSP. I guess TBD on AI's impact there. I plan more on the e-commerce space. But I think a well-architected go-live process, a lot of the benefits that a traditional certification process would have. I like to break it out into different phases. Stage 1, you'll have your penny test. Right? Development is complete and you're ready to go. So maybe a couple of weeks before you're actually ready to start a small segment of your traffic going to a new PSP, you use your own card, an employee card, to run a small amount transaction in production. And that just makes sure that the plumbing works, right? Your front end is working the way you expect it to. The back end is working the way you expect it to. You're getting funded in the right place and at the right frequency that you're expecting. Then you can just test it once it's been settled out. You can issue a refund and make sure that everything works in reverse going back to the cardholder. This also allows you to get a real world example of, going back to our finance conversation, the reporting, right? The reporting in Sandbox and reporting in production should usually be the same. But when you're dealing with simulated values compared to real values, there's usually going to be some amount of exploring that has to occur in order to consume the production reports in a way that makes sense to all of your backend teams. So that's phase one, the penny test. Phase two, you usually look at more of a limited launch, a friends and family release, a new product line, or a small business unit that represents not the bulk of your traffic as an e-commerce business. You turn that on, make sure everything follows the same path as stage one, just more at scale with real production volume. And then number three, once you're confident that everything looks good from a X's and O's, nuts and bolts standpoint, you want to make sure that you scale it and warm your mids. So your merchant IDs, your mids, when you move to a new payment service provider, don't necessarily have the same reputation that they did at your old payment service provider. Making sure that you have some amount of traffic before you really start turning on the floodgates of all your traffic is going to positively impact your approval rates. Generally speaking, depends on geography, but 30 to 60 days of this is usually sufficient. And then stage four is your full launch and your business as usual handoffs. At this point, your PSP's account team should be involved. They should be outlining any of the day-to-day business as usual activities, reports, escalation points that exist.
Not all payments are the same, right? There are platforms and marketplaces. There is what you mentioned, like retail, card present, and maybe like omni-channels. There are like subscription platforms. And of course, you probably know about many more like different cases, how payments could be accepted. Do you see any differences in integration and go live perspective for different types of payments? Are there any specifics that any of these types of businesses needs to take into consideration before enabling payments?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the process that we just walked through is broadly applicable to most people that go live in the digital economy. But when you start looking at different ways of engaging with customers, especially in marketplaces and other areas, you're not just dealing with customers, now you're dealing with sellers and everything that goes on the seller side of things. There's a lot of layers that get added to it. So from a software platform perspective, let's think about it that way. The overall go live process, I don't think is materially impacted as far as just accepting payments. Most of the time, your software platform is going to be utilizing a hosted plugin or some sort of known quantity with the PSP that should reduce the amount of uncertainty around the actual go live process to pretty much nothing, right? Ideally, it's been used before. Important question to ask your software partner, by the way, when you choose them is, has this actually been used in the wild before? It also depends on how much of that the PSP is controlling or how much of that the software platform is controlling and how much of that you're expected to control as the merchant. Going live in a new market where you may have to worry about different payment methods is usually going to have a different front end component involved in that. It's an important consideration to make in the go live process. If you've only accepted cards in the United States and now you want to start accepting local payment methods in Western Europe, the front end is going to look different. Front end looking different means that the software platform needs to do some amount of work, or your PSP needs to handle that in some sort of hosted or embedded component. So a consideration around there is what role your software platform is playing when you decide to make the move to add a new payment method, launch in a new region, etc. Of course, you also get into things like 3D secure mandates, localization, etc. The marketplace question is a pretty interesting one because you're adding a deep layer of additional touch point with your other type of internal customer, which is your sellers. Having a strong KYC and KYB policy in place and exception handling around that is really important. If your PSP is handling your KYC onboarding of sellers, you need to have a nailed down communication paradigm with your PSP around any adverse action that might occur. If a seller gets shut off for some reason, they're probably going to be pretty upset. They're going to contact you as the marketplace, and you need to have a good idea about what happened. Did they on board with the wrong KYC documentation? Maybe the scan of their passport was bad. That's a pretty easy thing to rectify. Maybe it's a broader problem, right? Where they are flagged for sanctions, something like that. It's a really important part of that, which often gets overlooked, is just nailing down exactly what that looks like for you and the provider that's handling these services, be it your PSP or someone else. When it comes to retail and omni-channel, I don't have as much experience in the retail space, but I would imagine that going live with this sort of cross-channel integration point would come back to making sure your systems are harmonized. You probably have a middleware somewhere in between, unless you're using the same provider for both point of sale as well as card not present. that's going to be marrying all that data together in some way for you to manage in a central location. So I think it just takes that same go live strategy that we had before, and you just have to replicate it twice to make sure that everything is harmonized in the central system that you're using for reconciliation, system of record, etc.
You mentioned pre-built components,
Mm-hmm.
and I think about this. There's also like a couple different opinions in the industry. From one point of view, pre-built components are great because they can speed up go live date, right, and make it easier to integrate. And I know like some providers, they provide components not only for checkout, right, but maybe for some reporting or like even like accounting tools that's make it really easier to integrate. But these components have two limitations. The first is you cannot fully control them, right? So they're pre-built, and I know it's basically like an iframe, right, that you're integrating, and you have very limited control. Once you integrate them, it will be harder to switch to another provider, right? Because it's not like you're surfacing from your backend. It's something that you're servicing from the payment provider. If you're switching to another provider, that's something that you need to replace as well, and it will be additional work. How do you feel about it? Would you recommend businesses to utilize these pre-built components, or is it something to play with caution?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic on the integration side because the industry at large has really come full circle on this topic. I think the dawn of m-commerce, so 2010, 2011, that kind of era of the iPhone where e-commerce moved from just a pure desktop-based experience onto mobile devices really showed a lot of the limitations of the hosted payment experience 1.0. That workflow was just not good for people who wanted to browse on their phones. The general sentiment among merchants in the digital economy was we need to move away from this because our customers are upset. They can't convert. It doesn't look good. Bad experience for everyone involved. And it was kind of a big blowback away from those hosted components towards more of the, we'll just handle the PCI ramifications of touching the card details ourselves. We'll build it all out. We'll do it ourselves. And then more recently, the pendulum has swung back the other way towards the hosted component of things because a lot of different providers are out there now with incredibly flexible options, things that are natively mobile first. Responsive design wasn't part of the design language of the original hosted payment page 1.0 ecosystem, but now it very much is. If you go to a PSP and you say, is your hosted solution mobile friendly? If they say no, you need to run screaming in the other direction. There's no excuse for that in 2025. So I think the fact that the user experience is a lot better across all different entry points into the e-commerce ecosystem has really made these a very good option for most people. I look at it as kind of an 80% hit rate. For about 80% of merchants, these sorts of solutions are going to work very well. There are always going to be some limitations when it comes to look and feel, but ideally those should be minimal, right? Or the trade-off should be worth the ROI to not have to develop and host the front-end component of things, or there should be some additional value add. I think where a lot of value comes to the merchants from the hosted component would be around offering lots of different payment methods without much work. If you want to A/B test different payment methods in different regions, having a component that's hosted and can show all those different things to your customers without needing to do any development work is huge. It removes a lot of the uncertainty around investing even a minimal amount of development work to add a new payment method if you can just light it up on the back end. And then I think number two, you also get into some areas where there's some potential conversion improving solutions that can exist. So if you have, let's say we take a market like the US where 3D Secure is not very common at all. It's very unusual to see 3D Secure here in the US as a US customer transacting with the US merchant. In other areas of the world, that's certainly not the case. You generally speaking don't want to deploy 3D Secure to US merchant or to US customers at this point in time. But maybe there's a scenario where your PSP can identify using AI that this specific bin for this specific type of purchase with this specific MCC on this specific amount has a 50% higher chance of approving the transaction with 3D Secure. Well, if you have a hosted component that can handle that, it's pretty easy for you to take advantage of that sort of cutting edge refinement strategy on your approval rates compared to if you have to do all these things yourself. So I think that's another area where you don't want to necessarily miss the forest for the trees, which yes, you do give up some control when utilizing these hosted payment components, but it's not always a negative thing. I think you start looking at the rise of orchestrators in the last 5-10 years or so. There's been a lot of talk about that, and being able to utilize multiple different hosted front ends, either through an orchestrator or slimming that down into an orchestrator's front end that allows you to tap into multiple different PSPs in the back end, can also be a bit of an insurance policy if there's some sort of hesitation around locking in fully to a payment service provider's front end component. I think I may have missed one of your questions in there, but that's generally how I feel about the hosted aspect of things.
I think what you mentioned about 3DS makes so much sense, because I've seen a lot of merchants who wants to be in control of the experience, and they're trying to own everything on their side, but they start missing all the latest and greatest tools that are provided by their payment provider. There is always a backlog on their side to implement these features because they're controlling it. What's already like pre-built by the payment provider, they'll be using these tools out of the box even without knowing it. Let's maybe talk about operations. They're always neglected during the integration, and then when business going live, then start realizing like, oh, actually we have to manage refunds. There are a lot of different cases with the refunds, or we start getting disputes. We need a process to handle disputes, like provide evidence and etc. And maybe like the volume of disputes is not what was expected originally from the operational perspective. How do you see that business can prepare their operational team that handles day-to-day transactions before going live or before switching payment provider?
Yeah, it's a really important topic to cover. Going back to some of the earlier themes that I talked about, it really does come back to making sure that you have a solid plan of attack for switching to or adding a new PSP from both a documentation and a planning perspective. Specifically in the solutioning phase, so one of the things that I do here at checkout.com is mapping out different customer journeys and all the different interfaces that can potentially result in a payment work stream. And then you have to work backwards and understand what different systems and teams may be impacted by that change. So maybe you have a really simple e-commerce website where there's one place to buy, it's only guest checkout, and that's a pretty simple one to map forward, right? You start dealing with multinational conglomerates who are selling with 50 different brands across 50 different websites and distinct business units. That becomes a much messier equation. So I think really trying to map out where the commerce journeys occur will give you a good idea of who you need to loop into those discussions, ideally as early on as possible. And I think that comes back down to really understanding the business, the challenge that you're solving for within the business, both either as the PSP or as the merchant. Being able to sit down at a whiteboard and draw those things out from memory at the end of the day is what allows you to succeed in that regard. An important thing to think about in that regard, what sort of projects you're trying to launch, right? Is this a simple lift and shift to a new PSP for existing customer work stream? Chances are the stakeholders and the teams that need to be involved are somewhat known to other internal stakeholders. So ideally, the merchant has an idea of who these parties may need to be. But when you start looking at expanding into brand new uncharted territory, right? Maybe you want to expand into a different region. You're going to be adding some local payment methods. You don't have experience with either of those things. That's where you need to rely on your PSP as almost a consultant, as a partner, to say, hey, what are the things that we're not thinking of when it comes to who we need to be involving in this sort of discussion? One of the things we've done with success is pre-mortem. Everybody in tech is familiar with a post-mortem. You have some sort of problem that was avoidable in some capacity, right? Or maybe not avoidable. You just want to understand what went wrong. You take a look at everything through a fine-tooth comb, and you come up with a suggestion on how you can prevent it moving forward. A pre-mortem takes that same idea, but puts it before you actually do the thing that caused the issue. Sit down and think through the launch for this particular initiative. If it's a multifaceted initiative, take it in bite-sized chunks and go milestone by milestone and say, if we failed to deliver on our milestone, what would have gone wrong? That gives you the mentality of going back and saying, okay, well, if we had launched here and nobody knew about ACH returns in the US, right? Maybe you're only dealing with credit cards. That means we could have had X amount of exposure come in from our anticipated refund rate, our anticipated dispute rate of X%, and that caused this sort of business harm. So I think sitting down and really trying to map out all of the ways things could potentially go wrong before you actually launch gives you a solid strategy for understanding who needs to be involved. Those sorts of questions direct you towards the lanes and the stakeholders that need to be involved to make sure that those mistakes don't happen.
I like how you mentioned that business can rely on their payment service provider as a consultant. Payment service providers act not only as a tool to provide a service or as an API, but as experts in domestic payment methods and payment regulations, or like all sorts of things, and provide this kind of like often free consulting services for businesses, which is a very interesting state of the industry right now. Talking about this consulting experience, what do you think business should do to stay up to date on all payments, regulations, and updates? What I see in the industry, it's a little bit tricky, right? Because like Visa, MasterCard, and other card networks, they introduce new rules, new regulations like card on file, PSD, and others. Sometimes these new updates sent to businesses, right? There's no open resource to go and review all the upcoming regulations. But sometimes it's business who is responsible to follow these regulations, right? Like to provide a certain field in the API request or collect some additional information from the customer. What is the best way for businesses to stay up to date and basically to follow all these changes and being compliant with card schemes and other regulations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I approach this in a couple of different ways. Number one, as a merchant, your payment service provider should be communicating to you in a regular basis. At the end of the day, the acquirer who is providing these services to you, specifically for card payments, they're going to be the ones who have to enforce them, and they're the ones who are ultimately going to face any sort of consequences if they're not implemented correctly. So if it's a change by Visa or MasterCard, and there's a potential punitive aspect to it to get fined for doing something that you're not supposed to do, the acquirer is actually the one who gets fined, and they pass that along to you. So that's usually a pretty good way of making sure that you close the loop there. Acquirers don't want to pay fines, and you probably don't want to pay fines either. So there should be a very clear communication paradigm for any sort of mandates that occur. We actually have a team internally, and that's all they do. They just sit and consume these updates as they come in. They ask questions, clarify, and then work with our internal communications team to keep our merchant base up to date. You should also ideally have a dedicated point of contact who can be reaching out to you instead of just getting an email. We do both, right? So we send out merchant communication emails that have broad depth of what's going on, and then account managers and technical account managers proactively reach out to stakeholders at our merchants to make sure that they have received those emails, understand the potential impact. The second area where I think it's really useful is to join different industry associations, right? Join MRC, subscribe to all sorts of different payment related communications, right? Joining different groups on LinkedIn, following different payments influencers on LinkedIn, like those sorts of things usually have a lot of industry chatter. What I found is that a lot of people, just because of the nature of e-commerce being very multifaceted, will have really good questions that I never even considered about a potential upcoming change to this payment method or this particular local regulation or this card network change. And there's a lot of really good feedback within the industry circle around that sort of thing. The MRC discussion board and Slack group is a great resource, as well as consulting and vendor reports can be pretty useful. So, subscribing to the Forrester Wave just to understand what's going on more broadly in the ecosystem. There's a lot of really good detail that goes into how different PSPs are approaching different sort of systemic challenges or more architectural landscape shifts. And I think that's a really good way to stay on top of that. Or, other consulting firms like Glenbrook do all sorts of work in this regard too. So a lot of different resources that are available, but I would definitely say, primarily speaking, your PSP, secondarily, industry groups, probably the best ones.
Yeah, I think it's a great list of services. And maybe that's another reminder that businesses who accept payments cannot just plug your payment provider and do nothing. A lot of work for a full-time employee to follow this, understand our list, your provider, but maybe even this is not enough, and you need to extend the source of information you're using. Considering that business just enabled payments and went live, what metrics do you think they should be looking at, and what sorts of KPIs and monitoring they need to put to be sure that payments are running smoothly? Payments, and they just see like list of transactions, and they see like, oh, we start getting some transactions, right? So they see some positives, some declines, and that's first indicators that things are working. But I would imagine that just looking at the list is not enough. So what metrics do you think you need to put in place to catch some problems earlier?
Yeah, I think in 2025, it's easy enough to integrate to multiple different PSPs where having any sort of problem with one PSP shouldn't materially impact your business. So going back to the planning phase of things, making sure that you plan for redundancy, you plan for the worst case scenario, and you hope for the best, you aim for the best. That's generally speaking the best practice around this, especially if you're launching with a new PSP who, no matter how fantastic they are ultimately going to be unknown, right? And how things get handled in that regard. I think, again, an ounce of planning is worth a pound of cure in this case, just to make sure that you do have a backup plan in case things go sideways on you after launching in whatever capacity that might be. I think specifically around metrics and reporting, AI is just absolutely critical. Making sure that you have some sort of real-time engine that can detect anomalies, super critical, and pipe those into a mechanism where people are going to pay attention. It becomes a bit of a fine line or more of an art figuring out exactly what level of notification is correct. If you make it too noisy, people ignore it, and then they tend to miss problems that actually are big deals. If it's not noisy enough, people forget it exists or panic every time there's like a 0.0001% drop from a certain issuer based in a faraway country, right, where you have almost no volume. So it's getting that right level of notification, I think, is a bit of a journey, and you have to iterate a little bit. But there's a lot of really great ways to do that. Key metrics to look at when adding a new PSP, adding a new payment method, adding a new region. Approval rate is always going to be pretty critical. If you launch with a new PSP and your approval rate is markedly different than your other PSP, you really need to understand why that's the case. And I said markedly different, not necessarily better or worse, because there are things to consider for both. If you launch with a new PSP and your approval rate is significantly higher, does that mean your old PSP had worse performance, or does it mean the definition of approval rate is slightly different between those two PSPs? I think that's another critical thing, is finding these KPIs and these metrics and then coming to a mutual definition with whatever your PSP, having that ongoing performance dialogue with your PSP is super critical to make sure you're reading from the same page and speaking the same language. Approval rate is super important. I think you also need to look at different velocity of different data elements. Ideally, you're working with either your PSP for a fraud solution or a dedicated standalone solution. Understanding how entering into new markets could impact your fraud ratio, could impact the new, as we all are aware of, VAMP added a card enumeration component to it. So bin attacks, even if they may not necessarily result in fraud, could potentially have negative impacts to you as a merchant. These sorts of things are important to keep in mind and to make sure that as you launch with new PSPs and in new regions, you have a common definition of what those things mean. Also understand how you can get that sort of data reliably back to your own internal reporting. I think knowing what your dispute rate is very critical, especially with the major systemic changes that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I think these are all great. Let's maybe talk about a specific example where you saw the integration went really, really smooth. Mm-hmm. And there were some, something great that was done there that you're like, oh, wow, that's something we need to implement in the process and start doing all the time. Maybe like outside of what we just discussed, what do you think is kind of like went really well there, and what would you advise businesses to do?
A few examples come to mind, and I think all of them have key themes in common. Number one would be, it starts way before the integration team actually gets involved. It starts with the level of engagement that the commercial teams and the business development groups on both sides have, and understanding the work that's already been done. I've not been on the merchant side, but I would imagine it's incredibly annoying to have somebody with the integration team come in and ask you to start over from scratch and explain everything that you've already spent years going over with different account teams in order to understand what problem you're trying to solve for, what the expectations are for success. That's a critical one, agreeing on mutual success metrics so that you understand what good actually looks like when you get there, but also understanding anything that goes into making those things come to reality. Ideally speaking, way before you get involved, there need to be conversations internally on the PSP side of things to have a brain dump. Ideally, memorialize that in some sort of internal document so that the integration team can come to the very first kickoff meeting with a very good understanding of what's going to happen. I would say that's phase 0, right? In order to make sure that the go live happens smoothly and that the integration goes as simply as possible and as I don't know, I can't think of a way to phrase that, but to make sure it's not a disruptive motion that's occurring. So that's, kind of phase 0. I think phase 1, 2 is going back to just all those things that we talked about before as far as mapping out the customer journeys. The solutions team on your PSP side should be able to recite these different customer journeys as well as you can. Ideally, they'll have some questions for you that you've not thought of before. That makes sure the right internal teams looped in, that makes sure that you have the right potential changes that need to be made to any sort of API messaging or any sort of interface accounted for, those things are known quantities. The partner ecosystem tends to be pretty big here because those sorts of integrations and pre-built connectors can drive different work streams. Partner ecosystems are a known quantity. So at least if you know that there's some sort of gap with partner A utilizing customer journey B to accommodate payment journey C, that can be communicated. You can figure out a workaround in the short term. You can figure out what your long-term plan is. Expectations being aligned are critical to making sure everything goes smoothly. Once you go live, we have this idea of hypercare. Once we have an account that goes live, the teams are dedicated to making sure they block off chunks of their day just to observe monitoring and to touch base regularly with all of the stakeholders for the client. So this idea of having a very narrow focus for a period of time after you go live and being able to spot any potential issues, which ideally don't occur, but if they do, then you can resolve them very quickly before they become large issues. I think those are all things that are very useful and have a common for successful merchant go live.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the payments industry in general.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite questions, and super curious about your opinion on this from the person who lives and breathes all these integrations and going live. What do you think is the biggest problem in the payments industry right now? What is the blocker for us to start having secure, compliant, streamlined, very easy, very quick payments every day?
Yeah.
What do you think is the main problem?
Yeah. I don't know if there's a single problem for those sorts of challenges, right, around security and compliance, but it comes down to a couple of things. Number one is the speed of innovation that we're seeing. You go back 10 years and accepting a credit card online hasn't really changed materially, but the way customers engage with e-commerce vendors and the way that e-commerce vendors can approach customers, not only from I'm selling you this thing or this service, but like we talked about before with marketplaces, just engaging with a new cohort of individuals that you can utilize in order to accommodate your commerce goal, that continues to change and to redefine itself year over year. I think the big buzz right now is agentic commerce, using AI agents to make payments. Visa and MasterCard, and we've been part of those initial conversations as well, are looking at ways that they can deploy tokens specifically for that sort of journey and work stream. And I think that's going to, in the short term, probably generate more questions than answers. But I think, again, it's an interesting component of working in the payment space. These problems come up, we course correct, and we figure out how to make it better. I think interesting things to watch, and will probably have their own set of challenges. You got to look at the macro with where we're at from an economic perspective, both in the US and otherwise, but macroeconomic uncertainty drives customer behavior. If customers are not as interested in spending money or have concerns about anything that goes into that, that's going to drive patterns and behavior that aren't necessarily desirable as a business. Those sorts of things are challenges to be aware of. PSD3 in Europe is a long way out, but is probably going to be relatively large. I don't think it'll be quite as big as PSD2 was based on early conversations. PSD2, as everybody in the industry knows, was a complete paradigm shift as far as what was required and represented just a lot of things that needed to happen. I think PSD3 is going to be more focused on refining some of those compared to the broad, sea changes. And then you also have within that the industry specific regulatory changes that are occurring, like VAMP's rollout back in March, and now we're in June, and it's changed, I think, 3 times as far as how the overall dispute ratio is being calculated and if rapid dispute resolution deflections count or not. There's been a lot of back and forth on that. The industry is not doing itself any favors when those sorts of changes are handled the way that they were. I don't have a specific single answer for the biggest challenge or blocker that we see to those sorts of things, but I see a lot of ways that all of these different things will probably result in really interesting innovation. If we have the same conversation 5 years from now, I hope my answer is incredibly different. So that's what I love about payments.
Yeah, I think it was great. What do you think is not that obvious, but very practical advice to all merchants how to improve their payments performance? Basically, if you met someone on the street and they're like, hey, we're accepting payments, what advice would you give them to improve their payments?
Make sure that you're working with a PSP who understands your business and is willing to give you the tools and recommendations that you need to grow your business in the direction that your business needs to grow. I have to keep that vague because every business is different. What good looks like to one business is going to be very different compared to another business, depending on what they're doing. The best way to improve your payments performance is to partner with a PSP who is willing to spend the time to understand exactly what's going on beneath the hood. Dealing with somebody who maybe only sells to a very specific set of MCCs, right? Maybe you have a PSP who focuses very narrowly on digital goods. If you're selling insurance premiums or car rentals or real estate, your business is so incredibly different from those sorts of challenges and the sorts of things that might be obvious in a different set of sales conditions. I think you just really need to make sure that you're partnering with somebody who can get into the weeds and see where you can optimize, because optimizations are different for all those different businesses based on all sorts of different factors. So I would say single best piece of advice I could give is to make sure that you can reliably count on your PSP to give you advice from the perspective of your business. If you're willing to experiment and try different things, we see a lot of success with that as well. Sometimes experiments don't always seem incredibly obvious, but if you're willing to ideate a little bit with your PSP, usually the results are worth it.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed being on here, Nikita. I can't wait to listen to what you guys have next. There's a lot of really interesting things happening on your show.